Is asking for a passenger's ID unlawfully extending a traffic stop? Guys, my name is Anthony Bandiero, attorney and senior legal instructor with Political Law Enforcement Training, bringing you another Roadside Chat. This one comes from an officer in Iowa. So if an officer asks for a passenger or passenger's ID with no reasonable suspicion for a crime, just merely asking, is this enough to possibly cause an extension of a traffic stop? Maybe it takes a minute or two, for the passenger to find the ID. Or maybe you're trying to get 3 IDs. Also, physically taking the ID, good, bad, it depends. If you ask for 3 or 4 passengers and their name and their DOB and you wrote them down, this could also take about 3 to 5 minutes. All right, so let's go through this. The answer is that it is problematic. It's not a slam dunk like yes or no. It is problematic because of a Supreme Court case called Rodriguez, right? Rodriguez versus United States. The idea there in Rodriguez that the Supreme Court said that you cannot prolong a traffic stop for unrelated issues, right? Now, they also recognize that officer safety is part of a traffic stop. So if what you're doing enhances your safety, then that's related to the traffic stop. That just makes sense. Also, you're allowed to pursue other investigations with reasonable suspicion and so forth. But one thing about Rodriguez is fundamentally what Rodriguez is about time. Rodriguez cares about time. It does not care about topic. So in and of itself, asking for a passenger's identification, if it does not add time, then it's no Rodriguez issue at all. And how can you do things that don't add time? Well, you can multitask, right? Maybe the driver is looking for the paperwork, and while the driver's doing that, you also ask the passenger for their ID. That would be fine if you articulate it. You can have a unavoidable downtime issue. You could be waiting for dispatch to return with something about the vehicle. Again, you can engage the passenger. And the best way is the backup officer, right? Somebody is writing that warning ticket, etc., and the backup officer is talking to the passenger and getting their identification. Now, that is kind of that's what's going on here. That's what my friend in Iowa is like, hey, is this causing an extension issue? In other words, is this causing a Rodriguez issue? All right, so back to where we are right now. I have no case that says that simply asking for a passenger's identification in and of itself is prohibited. And I think that's the right answer. I think it'd be very hard for courts to say that you came and asked the passenger for the identification. That issue that activity has been done for decades. And, no court I'm aware of has ever said that, no, you cannot do it under the Fourth Amendment. Now, some states like Oregon say that passengers are pretty much off limits unless you have reasonable suspicion as to them. But generally speaking, for all the other sane areas of the United States, that's not the issue. However, there is a very good argument that asking, okay, is fine, but what about demanding it? Well, we certainly know that you cannot demand a passenger's ID, okay, without reasonable suspicion, right? Don't say words like, hey, hand them up, or let me see your ID. Don't say stuff like that. What about also trying to sell it, right? The passenger's like, oh man, what did I do? Am I involved in this? I'm wearing my seatbelt. Why are you trying to identify me? And the cop is, it's like, hey, it's kind of routine for me to try to see who's in the car. Or another one I've heard is, hey, my boss, they always want me to know who I'm out with and who I contacted, just in case you have anything, to share and about my performance out here. At least they know you were here. Stuff like that is probably okay, but if you go beyond that and you're just not letting it go and you're adding time to try to identify passengers, it becomes very problematic. So the answer I have for you right now is simply asking for it is permissible, but be careful about them saying no or they don't want to do it. Just move on. All right. The next thing is, what about holding on to their IDs? Well, they're not free to leave anyway, right? We know about Brennan. So holding on to their ID, you can be like, well, now they're not free to leave, but they weren't free to leave when they had their own ID, right? So I don't think that's going to be the key issue, but best practice is to let them still have their ID. It causes less complications. It's one less argument. And the final thing that my friend is talking about is, all right, what about adding time to the traffic stop to run them? And I got to tell you, that's probably out of all these little issues, right? Asking, holding onto their ID, but then adding time to run them is probably the most problematic, because the question for the court is, all right, fine, asking for it is consent and all this other stuff, but are they related to that traffic stop? Well, no, because the driver was the one speeding, but we have the safety rationale. So would knowing who they are, if they're wanted and so forth, help our safety? I think the answer is yes. So I would go down that route and articulate it, but you got to start talking, be prepared to talk about how it's safety related. Not every court is going to buy this, by the way. I think that the Ninth Circuit is not really receptive to that argument. They seem to feel, or some judges at least in the Ninth Circuit seem to feel like, hey, you're actually compromising safety by running them because you're adding more time to the stop. Why not just kick them loose? Look, the judges don't live in your world, right? They live in their world, but just something to consider. But right now we're going to have case law define whether or not running them is prohibited. I think the answer right now, generally speaking, is no. You are allowed to add a little time to run them for safety purposes, but it should not be a lot of time. And one example I give is it's one thing to run 2 or 3 passengers. It's another thing to run a Greyhound bus full of passengers, right? Obviously, at some point, it's just going to add too much time. And if you're going to add a lot of time and it's not negligible, you should have a reason for doing it, right? All right, that's what I have for you. It's not clear. You guys are going to be making case law in this, so make good case law. Have a reason for what you're doing is a good piece of advice. All right. If you like what I'm doing here and this helps a little bit, I know it's still kind of gray, but if it helps a little bit, hit the like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends and so forth. All right, guys, keep up the great job of doing out there.